All right, let me get my slide up. Okay, that came through okay for you, Michelle?
Yep, looks great.
Yay, okay.
Hello, Marjorie. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you joining us today. My name is Michelle from Circonte, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. Yes, these sessions are recorded and will be available on demand after the event, and we'll also be following up with them via email. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the Q&A tab, and we will try to get to them by the end of the session. Lastly, use the chat. We've got emojis, GIFs, and more, and we do want to hear from you. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Heather, who has some awesome info for you all about simplifying complexity with Salesforce Flow. Take it away, Heather.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Happy to be here today. I hope everyone is enjoying day one so far of Marjorie. I've had the chance to sit in a couple of sessions this morning, and there were some really good sessions. I know that's just the start of the conference, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of the conference has to offer. So first, before we get started, of course, I want to say thanks to our fantastic sponsors. These are some great companies with some awesome tools and services to help a lot of our folks. And yeah, so thanks to everyone for everything they do for our dreaming. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Salesforce Flow. So we're going to go a little bit we're going to go cover a little bit of a primer first and talk about some of the basics of Flow. We'll talk about terminology and some good things to know about Flow up front. And then I'm going to cover off a few scenarios on how Flow can help marketing and sales teams. So we'll talk through scenarios and the different ways that Flow can help. We'll talk about some additional use cases, things to think about. My goal here is to give you an intro to Flow and give you enough inspiration that you can come away from the session and have a lot of ideas on things that you may want to do and in your own organization. We'll also talk about some tips and best practices, and I've got some resources at the end too, so you can dig in and start learning more. Okay, so Flow basics first. So this is Marjorie. This is a lot of focus on marketing and marketing automation. So chances are you all we're using or are very familiar with at least one marketing automation tool. I'm going to say Marketing Cloud Engagement. I'm going to refer to that quite a bit in this session, or Pardot. And that platform has a lot of great marketing automation features like completion actions, automation rules, engagement studio. There's a lot to choose from. However, there are times where there's some things that you may need that account engagement can't do for you. So when you need to do things like calculations or incrementing values, when you need to copy values from one field to another, or trigger something on a field value change, a stage change, if you want to send some custom notifications or update objects other than the prospect itself, this is a situation where you might need a little bit more help. And this is where Salesforce Flow can help. Now, Flow is available on the Salesforce platform, and it is a way to be able to use clicks, not code, to be able to build out and automate business processes. So you'll see it looks very familiar or very similar to account engagements, engagement studio programs, but it has a lot of capability to it. Allows you to create customized user experiences both on the back end and behind the scenes, as well as if you want to provide guided processes for your users. And also because they are declarative, which so that you're built using an interface, not coding, it's often easier to manage them rather than having to rely on developer experience to develop something in Apex. And you're going to see today, I have a ton of use cases for you. And that's just scratching the surface. There's lots that you can do. So we'll talk about flow types first. And when you actually go to create a new flow, this is the screen that comes up. You get to see several options for flow types, but we're going to talk about 4 in particular. The first we're going to talk about is record triggered flows. And this is where you would want to have a background process kick off when you have an event occurs on a record. So it's either changed, it's either updated or created or deleted. That kicks off actions, whether that's other record updates or other things like sending an email. This is a great way to be able to save time by having some manual processes that are manual now automated, so that you don't have to rely on somebody to do those steps for you. It also helps to make data entry more consistent because you are not relying on somebody to do that for you, and it can reduce that human error. There's some scenarios where you may find this useful is creating a task or sending a custom email when a lead status, for example, an MQL status is updated to MQL. Or if you have an account, for example, then the address changes, you want to update all of the related contacts. You can do that with a record triggered flow. Next, we have scheduled triggered flows. So these also run in the background, but unlike the record triggered flows that trigger off of a record event, this is going to run in the background based on a time interval. So you can set it to run at a specific time or day, at whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, in order to process a set of actions. This is great when you have specific tasks that need to happen at the same time every week, for example, and you don't have to rely on somebody doing this manually. One example might be assigning tasks to sales. This could be very useful. For example, if you are need to send follow-up messages to sales, maybe you've sent them a bunch of MQLs, and those leads are sitting there, you could schedule a flow to look at any leads that have not had any activity in X amount of days and schedule an email or a task to be sent and assigned to the sales user. That's just an example. Next, we have auto launch flows, and these are not triggered by a record or a time, but they are usually invoked by another process. So this is a great way to be able to take a set of actions that you want to occur in multiple processes and leverage them, package them up so that they can be used by those multiple processes. So a great way to do this is, if you want to be able to handle potential errors in your process, you could package up an error handling subflow and call that for most of your flows. We're also going to talk a little bit about a feature in account engagement called external actions. And this is another way that you can leverage auto launch flows by using external actions on the account engagement side to launch a flow and can be able to trigger a set of tasks. Lastly is screen flows. So this lets you create a guided interface in Salesforce for users to be able to walk through a series of steps to update records, create records, and it allows that custom tailored experience for them to guide them through the steps so that they're entering information when and how you want them to. So this can really improve the user experience. It definitely improves the process and data entry. And even just by the way that you provide the options in the screen flow, you could reduce the decisions that the user has to make when they're filling out, deciding what fields have to be filled in or not. The screen flow could do that for you. So what you see here is an example of a lead qualification screen flow. It just basically walks through And all the user has to do is define what took place and what's the next step, and it creates tasks automatically. What just happened, a task that just occurred, and then a task for the future. Okay, so what you can do in Flow, so these are some of the actions or elements that are available to you when you start to build a flow. This is not all of them. This is just most common. So from a data perspective, you can create records or update them. And you can also use the flow to actually go and find records in the database based on specific criteria. From a logic perspective, probably the most common element would be the decision element. So this lets you actually set up, define specific paths or branches based on criteria. And you can have you can have multiple outcomes or multiple branches depending on the way that you set up your criteria. You can use loops also to be able, if you're working with a group of records, to iterate and perform steps on one record at a time. And then assignments are a great way to be able to assign values to variables, which we'll talk about in a sec, that you can use later throughout your flow. You can also set up, obviously in screen flows, you have screens. These are individual interfaces that you can actually display record information. You can display text. You can all of the components that you can place on a screen to make the user experience as good as possible. Actions allow you to be able to perform tasks like sending an email or invoking maybe some custom code in order to perform some steps some additional steps outside the flow, like perhaps auto converting a lead. A subflow is essentially an auto launch flow that I mentioned earlier in terms of subflow types. And you can also have, so you can package up those steps and you can call it in the flow you're building, like that error handling flow I mentioned, as well as a new feature that's available as of winter 24, which is the custom error. And this lets you be able to customize the errors that appear. If you have an error come up in flow, you can handle it in a better manner than just a system generated error on screen. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, lastly, I'm going to go through resources. So these are common resources that are available to you when you're building flows. This is just something to keep in mind. I will refer to them a little bit when we're talking through a little bit of the scenarios, but most common ones are the variable, which is basically a container, stores a value that can be used throughout your flow. There are several different options, different data types that you can use between text, or number, or even an actual record. You can store the entire record, or multiple. So you can store multiple values in what's called a collection. Next, we have global variables, which are these, what you see here on screen. And this is sort of system provided information that you can access while you're in your flow. So in a record triggered flow, for example, you can actually access the details of the record that triggered the flow. Another common use case is to be able to grab the current date and time of when the flow ran, if you need to do any date stamping. You also have formulas. So if you're familiar with Salesforce formula fields, this is very similar. It allows you to calculate information, whether that's a number value, date, for example. A great use case is to be able to set a due date when you're creating a task, which is sort of the example I have here. And a text template. That's where you can actually pull together a template of text that you want to be able to use, whether that be in a task, subject, description, email body. You can use it in different places, and you can not just have static text, but you can also pull values from records that are in your flow, which can be very useful. The last item I'm going to mention is a couple of features that just to keep in mind, because if you do have account engagement, these could be features that you could take advantage of. So these are features on the account engagement side, but can work with flow. So there are external actions which allow you to you can pair an external action with an auto launch flow in order to trigger a series of actions, either from Engagement Studio or completion actions. And then external activities allow you to store data on your prospect from third-party systems, but you can leverage that through Flow to be able to write that information to your prospect in account engagement. Okay, so I'm going to go through some scenarios on how Flow can help sales and marketing teams, and we'll walk through each scenario along with some of the tools used and how it was built. So scenario one, we need to be sure that campaigns are activated when created in Salesforce. The status should be updated to completed when the campaign wraps up, and that we want to also put it in a way to automatically make sure that the actual costs are entered, so that we make sure we're able to track ROI, and we want to be able to do that in a timely manner. So the tools we can use for this are a record triggered flow, and we can use a feature of record triggered flow called scheduled paths to make this happen. So first, we'll start with our campaign that gets created in Salesforce. This triggers off a record triggered flow on the campaign that has 3 paths. So one will run immediately, and that's going to just make sure the campaign is active on creation. The second path is scheduled to run 14 days after the end date of that campaign, and that will deactivate the campaign. It will uncheck that active box, and it will also make sure that the status is set to completed. And then it's also going to check if actual cost is provided here in this decision. And if it's not provided, we're going to send them an email with send the owner of the campaign an email to make sure that, as a reminder, to make sure the actual cost is set up. The last path is another reminder 45 days after that end date, just as a check, just to make sure that the actual cost was provided. If it wasn't, it's going to send that reminder again. Okay, scenario number 2. We want our enrollment specialist to follow up with prospects that registered for a webinar but didn't attend our session. We need to understand their barriers to entry and potential objections. So we can do this with a record triggered flow, and we can do this using one of those elements that I mentioned earlier called a loop. So let's assume that prior to this, we have created leads and contacts. We've added them to the campaign with a status of registered. After the webinar is done, how the campaign members are updated to either attended or no show, depending on how they attended. So that's done on the background, either through a third-party integration or through import or some other way. When the campaign is updated and marked completed, we can use a record triggered flow to trigger it. As long as it's a campaign that's completed and the campaign type is webinar, we can use a get element to check if there are any no-shows. So that is just doing a search of our database to double check any members that are associated with this campaign that have a status of no-show. We're going to check if make sure that we did find some. If they didn't find any no-shows, that's great. Then we can just exit the flow and not worry about it. If they did, we're going to loop through each member, and we're going to use an assignment here where we're going to actually start to prepare follow-up tasks for the campaign member. Rather than creating a campaign task each time we go through this loop, we actually want to just prepare them and store them, collect them, and then that way we can create them all in one place at the end once we finish our loop. So you can see in this section in my prepare follow-up task, I'm actually using several resources in order to make this happen. I'm using a record variable to store all of the values that I want to be in this task. I'm using a formula field in order to determine what that due date should be. For example, if it's 7 days after the current date. And then I'm using some values from the record that is currently in the loop in order to populate some of the other fields. When I have everything I need for that task for that specific campaign member, then I'm going to store it in my collection, and I'm using a collection variable to store that. Then we're taking that collection variable, and then I'm telling the flow here, okay, now we want to create all of the follow-up tasks, and we're going to do it in all at one time. We're going to create multiple records using this collection variable. Scenario number 3, we want to be proactive at engaging members when their membership renewal date is approaching. An opportunity and a task, we want that to be created for folks 30 days before that expiry date, so that they can start reaching out to that member. We also want to be able to add them to a renewal nurture until they sign up. So we can do this with some standard out of the box Salesforce fields, like a formula field. We'll use a schedule triggered flow, and we'll use a third party tool called Flow Actions for Pardot to help us add them to that nurture. So prior steps would be, let's assume that we've created those custom fields. We've got one that actually tracks that membership expiry date, and then a checkbox, a formula checkbox that's set to be checked when the expiry hits 60 days away. That checkbox is going to be used in a schedule triggered flow that is set to run daily. It's going to check for any contacts that have that checkbox set to true. And if they do find that, they're going to create a task with some key information. Again, I'm using more resources for this. I'm using formula fields, and I'm using text templates here to be able to see the subject and some values from the record that the flow is using right now. I'm creating a opportunity and tying it to that contact, creating an opportunity. And then the next step, I'm actually creating the opportunity contact role, because of course we want to make sure that that person is connected there. Next, I'm using an action from Flow Actions for Pardot, which allows us to actually reach out to Pardot and say, okay, I have this prospect, I have this person. This is where I want to add them to a static list. And on the account engagement side, I'm using that static list in order to enter them into a campaign. Scenario 4. We want to send an 8-week nurture campaign to 20,000 cold prospects. If somebody clicks through, we want our team to follow up with a Salesforce task. They'll close it when they get a hold of them, but until that happens, keep emailing them. So we can do this with a few tools. We've got a dynamic list that we're going to use to manage that nurture and engagement studio program. We've got a record triggered flow that's going to help us with managing some of this, and then also using flow actions for, actually, I think that's a typo. I don't think this one includes flow actions for Pardot. So we start out with our dynamic rules. So if you're using account engagement, this is probably familiar to you. So we have dynamic rules based on status, campaign status. We have some folks that are in here that we want to be, that based on their status, they're being added to a dynamic list. That once they're added to that list, they're being entered into an engagement studio program. When they are clicking on the emails, among some of the actions is creating a task for the salesperson to reach out. And this is just straight out of account engagement. In Salesforce, we have our task that we want sales to follow up with. When they complete that task, this will trigger a record triggered flow that's set to run on any task associated with this campaign. That task will then check that flow will check the lead or the contact that this is related to, and then mark their status as contacted. By updating that status, that's going to remove them from this dynamic list, and then it's going to remove them from the engagement studio campaign. Okay, last scenario. When a lead fills out a form, we want to trigger a custom email to sales and include detailed instructions on how they should follow up in a task. And we want to include form fields in that information so that they have it, or the form details so they have it. So how do we do this? We can do this using, on the account engagement side, a completion action. We'll also use an external action and an auto launch flow. So we have, on the form side, we are using a conditional completion action set up when the prospect fills out a form and is a lead. We're going to execute an external action and give that external action is going to call a flow, and it's going to give them this information, the email and the ID of that prospect. The auto launch flow gets triggered. We're first checking just to make sure that we have the ID, and so that we can use that ID to find the record associated with the prospect. And then we're going to create a task for that lead and send an email to sales. So our lead task, we can use some of the information that has been passed from account engagement, like some of the last form completed information, and then same with the email. All right. Okay, so that's 5 scenarios. So now I have some more. So what else you can do with Flow? So hopefully this is starting to inspire you and get you anxious to start maybe trying this yourself. So some things to get started if you haven't built a flow before, for example, standardizing campaign member statuses on campaign creation. This happens, right? I mean, we create a webinar campaign, the standard statuses are sent and responded. Those aren't very ideal. So maybe we want to standardize those so that every time a campaign gets created with a type of webinar, we're making sure that we have the right statuses and not relying on somebody to do those manually. We can date stamp when something happens. Now, I know that on the prospect, we can do that on the account engagement side, but maybe we want to date stamp something that occurs either maybe not in account engagement, maybe it's something that happens on the Salesforce side, like when a lead changes stages, and we can actually track velocity of the movement through stages or through statuses, and likewise for opportunity stages. We can make sure that account information is updated when an opportunity is marked closed won. From a marketing perspective, we covered this in our workshop yesterday. We had, when the opportunity is closed won, we marked the account as a customer. We looked at the tier, or we set a tier of platinum, gold, or silver based on the opportunity amount, and we stamped the purchase date, so when they became a customer. We can also, we covered off sending custom email or create task. And I think I mentioned this earlier. So we could set up a scheduled flow to actually look at leads that don't have any activity for a certain amount of time and send them an email. And another one that can commonly come up with if you have account engagement business units and you're wanting to take advantage of marketing data sharing, is having a flow. You set the criteria that you think that is necessary to make that prospect sync with or visible in account engagement, and use it to set that marketable field that you can use in that marketing data sharing. Okay, so there's more. So this is where you can take things a step further. So you can maybe you want to be able to track persona based on title. So you can do this with Flow based on specific includes or does not include criteria. You can record and track UTM touch points, whether it's saving them on a custom object or maybe you want to save them on the campaign member. You can send information, sync information between an external system. So this can be helpful if you have information you need to get from your ERP, for example, anything that has a published API. We talked about using it for guided process, and also using it to convert a lead. We looked at external actions earlier, but there's probably a lot of different use cases that you could use this for. And then also for using third-party tools like Flow Actions for Pardot to be able to have it work directly with Pardot data or perform Pardot admin actions. And I've got a QR code here to be able to access Flow Actions on the App Exchange. You'll get this content anyway, that you can reference it later. These are just a few examples of the things you can do. There are also a couple of other App Exchange products that may be useful for external actions. And these are account engagement automates is sort of the series, and one is record creation, and the other one that just came out, I want to say in the last week, is lead reassignment. So you can actually use it. The App Exchange products include everything you need. You just have to do a couple steps to turn things on, but the flow is already pre-built, and you have these available to you on the Pardot side. Okay, so I think we're doing okay on time. So I'm going to go over a few tips when you're building. So first, this is going to be a best practice I'm going to mention a couple times, but when you are starting when you are creating your record triggered flow and you are setting your criteria about what records end or enter your flow, you really want to be specific about what those triggers should be, about those entry criteria, because you don't want your flow to trigger off of a record when it shouldn't. So you've got options to be able to do this on the start. I just got a note saying I had an error. Michelle, do you guys still see my screen?
Yes, I see everything. You seem to be good.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I was still connected. Okay, so on the trigger side, you have some options on what you can, how you can set that criteria. So you can set it based on setting specific conditions that it must meet all the conditions. So if the field equals a specific value, maybe more than one. You can set it to be or you can set custom condition logic. If you think of logic like when you're doing reports and you have filter logic where you can say like 1 and 2 or 3, you can set that here. And then you can even use formulas if you have very specific and very complex criteria. The other element I'll mention on flow optimization is is when you're setting your start criteria, you want to determine how this is going to trigger, not just when it is, but also how it's optimized. So there are two options here: fast field updates and actions and related records. You may also hear these referred to as before save and after save flows. So fast field updates will occur these updates will occur on the record that triggered it, and it will happen before the record is saved. So think about a scenario where you have an account that gets created and you have a record triggered flow that you want to standardize the account name. So you can set that, if that's the only thing that's happening in that flow, is you can set it to be a fast field update. And when the account is created and the user hits save, that account name is standardized by the flow before that save is completed. So it all happens in the same transaction. So you would use this if you're updating fields on the record that triggered the flow itself. That's the only time you would use this. The other option is actions and related records. And this is where you use, where you would, in any other situations where you want to be able to update or create other records, maybe records that are related to the record that triggered it, or if you want to send an email or something along that line, you would choose actions and related records. Wherever possible, if you are just making updates on the field itself or on the record itself, fast field updates is highly recommended, because especially if you have a lot of flows that are running, it is a way to be able to optimize the performance of your org. I mentioned this earlier, but I'll highlight this. Custom error messages. This is something that came out in winter 24. This is great for having better graceful error handling. So you can add this as an element. So if for some reason you have an error, maybe you go to create a task and and maybe you're assigning it to a user and that user is inactive. You could add an error message on what's called a fault path, and you can actually specify that you have, that they need to take a look at the user, or some other common customized message for them. In this scenario I've got as an example here, this is triggering when we're creating an opportunity and or updating an opportunity to a stage, and the opportunity doesn't have a contact role. So triggering that so that it actually would not. It's almost like a more sophisticated validation role just to make sure that they have these error messages are triggered and guiding the user as much as possible. The messages, I will say as well, is the fact that you can create additional multiple messages. You can specify where they appear, if they're in line with the field or on this or on the like a window. And you can also add resources. So you can actually pull in resources from the record or other information, and you can customize them. So they don't have to be the same message across the board. I think this might be the last tip, is Flow Trigger Explorer. So when you're on your flows page, next to the new flow button is a Flow Trigger Explorer button. This is a great way to be able to see all of the triggered flows that are set up in your org by object and by event. So you can see if you're thinking, well, I think we need a lead, we need a flow for when a lead, status changes or something like that. You can actually go in and take a look. Well, okay, when a lead is updated, these are all the flows that are running, either active or that are available and inactive. So it gives you an idea if there's something already out there that may be close to what you're already looking for, and just might need to have a little tweak or additional action added. So it's a good idea to take a look at that before you start building. So some of these I've already mentioned several times, for best practices. Whenever you're going to build a flow, it's a good idea just to kind of like figure out the process itself before you start actually getting in there and building. So, whether that's on a whiteboard or using, whatever Lucidchart or some other tool, to be able to just make sure everybody's on the same page on what's going to happen when. When you are building, it's highly recommended you build in a sandbox. You do not want this to run or without being fully tested and validated, and risk impacting your business and your business data. I mentioned you want to be specific about your start conditions and your get elements. So you want to make sure that when you are looking for records in the database, you want to make sure that you are very specific about the records that you want to work with, so that when it does pull a record, it's the one you want. Flow also has features to be able to cut and paste. So if you have a couple of paths and they are essentially performing the same actions, and there are just some differences maybe in some of the values, you can actually copy and paste them instead of recreating everything over again, so that it just saves time and speed things up. Another one is save often. So engagement studio programs in account engagement, you can create them and they save for you. You don't have to worry about actually clicking a save button. Flow is not like that. So you want to be able to actually save it early and save often, so that you never know when your network might fail, or when your browser may crash, or some other situation, or you might get pulled away in time and it just times out on you. So you definitely want to save. You want to be able to test and debug your flows before you activate them. There are features to do that. We've got some links to information to help you with that. And then there is an actual step where you have to actually hit an activate button in order for it to be running and available to be triggered when and where you are expecting it to. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so I have a lot of resources here to go through, and this isn't even a lot. This isn't even all of them, but if you're just learning flow, or just maybe early on in your journey, this is a good place to start. I would say probably with the first couple of items here in Trailhead, just to kind of get a little bit of familiarity with flow. Then you can start digging in a little bit more and get some inspiration from some of these other places. And I've got some step-by-step guides here on how to do some common how to use Flow to build some common processes. All right. So thank you. I hope that was of value, and I guess we can tackle some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather. That was an amazing presentation. We're going to do some Q&A now. So we do have some questions already. But if you have additional questions, you can hop over to that Q&A tab right now, and we can start answering them. So Heather, one of the first ones, I don't think we can do it, but I would love if this was a feature. Can you make a custom error message and send notifications for Pardot to Salesforce sync errors?
Well, if somebody else on their team on you, there are probably a couple other folks that would probably say to chime in. I'm pretty sure it's a no, because the only place you can trigger the flow in account engagement is in, at least right now, is in a completion action or engagement studio program. And so I don't think that there's a way to be able to do that, have a sync error trigger it. But that would be good feedback for the product team.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to have that feature. Okay, another question that we have from scenario 2 about webinars. Could you use Flow to create webinar campaigns automatically based on third-party webinar connector with Pardot? Then use the Flow to update member statuses based on the data in Pardot, like attended or absent, then do the flow you showed. Can we do that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the how is going to depend on the platform. Like, so it is likely possible based, depends on what the webinar platform is, because there would have to be some additional development in order to be able to tap into the API of that webinar platform. We have done this for with a Zoom integration in order to be able to do this. I don't know if Adam's on, but we have folks from our Salesforce, or sorry, Sercante Labs team that could probably weigh in on this a little bit more. But we have done that where we actually have tied into the webinar and have that execute based on webinar creation and based on the activity of the webinar.
Awesome. Does anybody have any more questions? Okay. I don't see any more coming through. So thank you again, Heather, for this session. And that concludes the session for today. Big thanks to all of our sponsors. If you haven't had a chance yet, go check them out. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without them. You are going to see a quick survey pop up. So if you could take that for us, we would appreciate it. And if not, hope to see you guys at more sessions today.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy more gaming. Thanks, Michelle.